What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. The topic of today's training video is Open Raising 101. Now, you might be wondering why we are tackling a topic which is generally considered to be one of the most basic areas in poker. But I actually get a surprising amount of questions on topics which I consider to be fundamental to this part of the game. And I think the reason is generally players have a tendency to look at a bunch of preflop open raising ranges, then assume that they know everything they need to know about open raising. Actually, open raising is a lot more nuanced than this, and just knowing the basic default opening ranges is very simply only the beginning of open raising strategy. So today we're going to make sure you do actually know the basics of open raising, and if you already know everything in this video, then great. But some of us might be surprised, because there are even players whom I consider to be maybe quite experienced, or they've been playing the game for a period of time and they don't understand some of these fundamentals. So let's have a look at the topics we are going to consider. Firstly, we will talk about default ranges. That is the starting point for this topic. We'll talk about attacking tight blinds. We'll talk about isolating versus recreational opponents. So we're not talking about ISO raising here, we're talking about maybe stealing from late position, or any position at the table really when we know that there is a weaker player at the table. We'll also talk about default preflop sizings and exploitative preflop sizings. Firstly, default ranges. The first step is very simple. Learn default raise first in ranges stroke frequencies from each position. It's actually very surprising how many players don't even do this step. Perhaps they will consult some hand charts and then they will proceed to just go and play by feel at the tables. And there are many players who don't even look at starting hands charts because they say that they are field players and they just base their decisions on who is at the table. Now, of course, this is very important. We should base our decisions on who is at the table, but we do need a starting point. So it's all very well saying I'm going to play looser because there's a certain player in the blinds, or I'm going to play tighter because there's a certain player in the blinds. But tighter or looser than what? We need a default starting point. So that's why we have a look at things like starting hand charts. And we'll generally find that these things take on a new meaning when we reach a very high level in the game. So typically players who are starting out at poker, they learn default starting ranges. Then they often go through a period of time where they don't really use any starting ranges. They know roughly what they should be doing pre-flop, and they consider starting hand charts to be for beginners. Then very often we reach the next stage where we're interested in our starting hands again, because we need to perform calculations on the flop where, in order to know the best play with one hand, we really need to think about every single holding in our range. And in order to do this, we need to know with what kind of ranges we're reaching certain flops with. So starting ranges, or being very specific about the opening hands we use, starts to become more important again as we approach poker at a higher level. So just on a very basic level, let's have a look at some of the default opening frequencies. They should look something like this. So button open raise here. Now this is going to represent about 47.51% range, as you can see towards the top there. This is a very standard button opening range. Small blind, we have about 36.65. We're mainly interested in the blue color here. One of the reasons why the small blind is actually different from the other positions at the table is it can be correct to employ a completing strategy in the small blind. And the area in yellow represents the type of range we could potentially play, assuming that we wanted to use a completing strategy in the small blind. And this is something that has filtered down from higher limit games. So players at the high limits realize that, okay, it's okay to open raise with a 36% range to start off with, but it's also a very viable strategy to start out by open limping around about a 70% range, and then have a range of hands that limp raises, a range of hands that limp calls, and a range of hands that limp folds. So we're mainly going to be interested at first in the raise first in strategy, which is outlined here in blue. The open limping or completing strategy is maybe a topic for a different day. Cutoff raise first in frequency 27.9 in this case. This is not exact, by the way. It would be fine if you open raise 26 or you open raise 28. That's not going to make a huge difference, so long as we are roughly within the ballpark frequencies assigned here. MP 18.85%, looks something like this. UTG 13.88%. Now it's all very well going through these raise first in ranges, but it's also important to understand how raise first in ranges are constructed. And this is one of the questions that I've always found it very, very interesting to ask poker players, even advanced poker players. And the results can be sometimes surprising. Many players have a raise first in strategy, but if you ask them where their raise first in strategy came from or how it was constructed, then they have next to no idea. The most common response seems to be, oh, I use so-and-so's ranges, he gave me some starting hand charts, I didn't construct them myself. Very few players actually construct their own RFI ranges. Or maybe players do construct their RFI ranges, but they are using the frequencies we've just discussed. Perhaps they open raise from 14% from UTG. They open 18% from MP, for example. And then we could ask them, where did you get the frequencies from? So they have constructed their own range based on pre-assigned frequencies, but they've got no idea how these frequencies were constructed in the first place. So once again, they're borrowing information from someone else rather than constructing their own strategy. But surely someone somewhere in the beginning of poker had to sit down and decide what these raise first in ranges and frequencies should be. So how was that actually done? There are generally three methods used to construct preflop ranges, not just raise first in ranges, but all kinds of preflop ranges, 3-betting, cold calling, etc. The first method that is used is generally referred to as empirical analysis. Now what this means is basically having a very large database of hands and having a look at how those hands perform over a large sample. For example, imagine I'm in middle position with Queen 10 offsuit. I want to know if Queen 10 offsuit makes me money. Obviously the outcome of any individual hand is not that relevant. What I'm interested in is how Queen 10 offsuit does over the long run. So I sit down, I play 5 million hands in my database, or maybe I collect hands from a whole bunch of different players. Then I have a look, how is Queen 10 offsuit doing as an open raise from MP? If Queen 10 offsuit appears to be making money on average, then I will keep that hand in my raise first in range. If Queen 10 offsuit from MP seems to be losing money, as it probably does, then now I'd say this is not a good open, I'm going to remove that from my raise first in strategy. So this is the first method of analysis, using databases over a large sample. Now there are some problems with this method. For example, I might open a hand like King Queen offsuit from the cutoff. Have a look at my database over 5 million hands and I find out that I'm losing money with King Queen offsuit. So what's happened there? Is it because King Queen offsuit is not a profitable open? Well, that surely can't be the case because most of us are pretty clear on the idea that we should be open raising King Queen offsuit from the cutoff. So why is my database telling me that I'm losing money with King Queen offsuit? Well, maybe it's because that I'm doing something wrong post-flop. It doesn't necessarily mean that the hand is an incorrect open pre-flop, it's just that in my database I can't separate my pre-flop results from my post-flop results. So maybe I simply have post-flop leaks which are obscuring whether a certain hand is profitable pre-flop. The same of course could happen with a hand which is not theoretically a correct open, but because the player pool is so bad, we find ourselves making money with that holding, when in theory it should be a minus EV open. So there are some limitations to empirical analysis. The second method of analyzing or constructing preflop ranges is using a game theory approach, attempting to use our knowledge of mathematics to construct a strategy based on preventing our opponents from being able to generate automatic profit. And the third way is probably the most commonly used way, at least in the earlier stages of players playing poker, which is very simply logic. And that might sound like a very, very simple technique, but it's very important for poker players. For example, how is it that we know that we shouldn't be open raising something like 7-deuce offsuit from under the gun? Is it because we've subjected that situation to game theory analysis? Is it because we played 5 million hands and seen whether 7-deuce offsuit was a losing play? No, we know 7-deuce offsuit is not an open from UTG purely based on logic. We've got 5 or more guys to act behind us, it's not a very good starting hand, it doesn't have any big cards, it's not connected. Logic tells us that we're probably not going to make money by open raising 7-deuce offsuit, so we don't do it. Armed with this knowledge, we should be able to have a look at the raise first in strategy that we're using and analyze it with the methods that we've discussed, and try and work out if we are actually using a good raise first in strategy. So don't just use a raise first in strategy because it's been given to you. you want to take some time to analyze that strategy and establish whether it is actually a decent and logical strategy. Okay, second on the list we have attacking tight blinds. First thing to understand here is that poker is about stealing the blinds. Now, that might be a little bit of an overstatement, but in some ways it's not, because if you've ever been encouraged to think about the scenario where we try and play a game of poker where there are no blinds. So it's regular 6-max poker, but no one has to post any blinds. How would that game be like? Well, generally players are not going to be incentivized to play many hands in that scenario. In fact, it wouldn't really make sense to play any hand that wasn't pocket aces. Everyone would just be sitting there waiting. There'd be no pressure because we wouldn't have our stack being eaten away by the blinds since there are no blinds. We have the luxury of being able to sit there until we're dealt pocket aces. So without the blinds, poker doesn't really exist. It's the blinds that add that extra pressure onto us and force us to play hands that we wouldn't normally want to play. So essentially, poker doesn't work without the blinds, and you could say that the objective of poker is to try and steal the blinds. So we want to find as many situations as possible where we can do that, and we'll find that if we can do this efficiently, then it will have a great effect on our win rate. Now there are two simple rules that we want to understand for this. Number one, when can we open any two cards from the small blind? Number two, when can we open any two cards from the button? Now this is based around the principles for automatic profit, and I'll just show you roughly how this works. It's going to be based on our pre-flop sizing to an extent. So imagine, for example, we're in the small blind, we decide to open raise to 2.5 big blinds. We'd actually be investing 2 in that scenario because there's already 0.5 of a big blind in the middle. And the total pot size after our raise would be our 2.5 plus the big blind's 1, which means we'd be investing 2 into a total pot of 3.5. Basically, our steal needs to work 57% of the time to generate automatic profit. Now, automatic profit is a very important concept in No Limit Hold'em and most poker variants, and it basically tells us that we can make profit without needing to do anything on a later street. In other words, if our opponent is folding more than that 57% threshold, we can open raise any two cards pre-flop, we can check fold every single flop, and we'll be making money. The way we use this is making sure we add the appropriate stats on our HUD. So we want the big blind fold to small blind steal on our HUD. Anytime we're in the small blind and we see our opponents folding more than 60% of the time, we should be playing very aggressively, we should be opening any two cards. What about for the button? The maths is the same, and once again it depends on the sizing. So for example, imagine we min-raise the button. So we're going to be investing 2 big blinds, the total pot would be 3.5. It's actually a very similar calculation. We can see we get the same value here, 57%. Now of course, this is a combined total. So combined, both of the blinds need to be folding with this frequency. So if one of them folded 57 and the other folded 57, then they would actually be folding a lot less than 57% overall. So individually they're going to be needing to fold much more than 57%. Without going into any maths, as a very rough guide for the button, what we can do is take the generic fold to steal stat for the small blind, for the big blind, add them together, and if their combined total is over 150, then we should open raise any two cards from the button. So for example, I look at the small blind, his fold to steal is 80. I look at the big blind, his fold to steal is 70. I add the two numbers together, that's 150. I should be opening any two cards in that scenario. You can also make use of other stats. For example, if you have Note Caddy, you could construct a stat which is blinds fold to button steal. That might be more useful. Or if you want to, you can specifically use small blind fold to button steal and big blind fold to button steal, although now you'll have to have extra fold to steal stats on your HUD, which will take up more space. Stealing is crucial in poker. Don't just stick to your default opening ranges. Make sure you are switched on and pay attention to these scenarios where opponent is clearly overfolding to steal attempts, and make sure you really abuse these spots. Be very, very aggressive. Number 3 on our list, isolating fun players. So as we mentioned earlier in the video, we're not talking about ISO raising here. We're talking about trying to get the pot heads up against weaker opponents. Now the important thing to understand here is that we should expand our opening range when there are weaker players at the table. Sometimes this confuses players, because sometime back in the past, some clever player came along and thought to himself, well, if we should open wider against tight blinds, then surely we should open tighter against loose blinds. No, this is completely wrong, because many of the loose blinds are actually the calling stations. These are the players who we want to play against, who are going to boost our win rate. We should play a wider range against them also. It's only really decent, aggressive regulars who are maybe quite 3-bet happy where we're not going to expand our range. If our opponent in the big blind is a huge calling station, we're not necessarily just going to play really tight because he's a calling station. We want to play against calling stations. We're actually going to expand our range in that scenario. So also expand opening ranges versus calling stations from every position at the table. Although, as we'll see a little bit later, it's much more important that we do this from late position and a little bit less important that we do it from early position. Another thing we can do is we can decrease our open raise sizings, and we're also going to talk about open raise sizings very shortly. So what we mean by this, let's imagine we're on the button and we have a hand that's not part of our standard button opening range. Let's say, for example, we have King 6 offsuit or Queen 7 offsuit, or maybe 10-3 suited or something. Now, we wouldn't normally play this hand if we knew that the players in the blinds were good regulars. But let's say in this case the big blind is terrible. Okay, true, he never folds pre-flop, so we definitely don't expect to steal the blinds. But his post-flop play is so bad that we feel that we can make a ton of money by playing heads up against him. So we do want to play stuff like King 4 offsuit, because even though it's outside of our standard range, we should be able to make it profitable. However, we don't necessarily want to raise really big. The goal here is to initiate a pot heads up, not to build a huge pot. In the case that we have something like 8-3 suited, for example, building a huge pot is probably not a good idea. We want to keep the pot small until we hit. Because ultimately, if we open raise to 3 big blinds with 8-3 suited, and our opponent makes, a really bad call with something like 10-8 offsuit, which wouldn't be that bad, but you get the idea. Well, he's actually got us dominated there in that case. We're just building a pot in a situation where we have an equity disadvantage. So keep in mind that if our goal is to expand our range because there are weaker players in the blinds, we probably want to be using a small sizing. This is also true in the cutoff as well, small blind as well. And by extension, the earlier positions, although there is a little bit of a trap with earlier positions. So if we just have a look now at a raise first in range from UTG again. Maybe just think for a minute. Let's imagine that we are under the gun on a 6-handed table. This is what we normally open. However, we notice that there is a huge calling station in the big blind. So how wide should we go now with our opening range? The trick here is to expand our range slightly and not go too far. We don't want to be one of these guys who's opening Queen 6 suited from UTG because big blind is kind of bad. He's not really a huge fish, he's 23-18, but maybe he folds a shade too much to c-bets or something. That's not a good enough reason to open Queen 6 suited. In fact, even if big blind is a huge donk, that's probably not a good enough reason to open Queen 6 suited. Because we have to factor in that there are 4 other guys at the table. So we're going to get cold called, we're going to get 3-bet by them. We're just not going to end up heads up against a weaker player often enough. So if we have a look at this range, we'd probably open some suited aces. We might open King 9, Queen 9 suited. At a big stretch, we might open Ace 10, King Jack offsuit. We'd probably open any pocket pair. Maybe something like 10-8 suited. But that's probably about it. So we don't want to be opening stuff like Queen 5 offsuit just because the small blind is a fish or something. The other mistake players make is they try and isolate themselves against players who have position on them. That's usually not too smart. So okay, maybe we might think about opening King 8 suited in a really extreme scenario. However, we don't want to be doing that from UTG to try and isolate ourselves against MP, who is a very bad player. It doesn't work like that. We specifically want our opponents to be in the blinds. Otherwise, it's barely worth expanding our opening range for. Now, button is different because button, we might not just expand slightly, we might expand our button opening range to 22 cards. In extreme cases where big blind is absolutely terrible, there's no reason why we can't open min raise something like 3 deuce offsuit on the button just because we want to play heads up against the big blind. Keep in mind that the effective stack is important, so we don't want to be min raising against a bad big blind if his effective stack is 15 big blinds. That would be a mistake. but assuming he has a reasonably sized stack, we can pretty much get away with playing any 2 cards and hoping to play heads up against a weaker player. Okay, moving on. Default preflop sizings. Another question I like to ask players is, how do we go about calculating what type of default preflop sizings we should be using? I also like to ask players, where did you get your preflop sizing plan from? And again, very often players can't answer this question. Very, very frequently they have copied their default preflop sizing from someone else. I use the same sizing as, this coach that I watch, or I made up my sizings based on a written article. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, but it's interesting that the majority of players, some of whom even have strong feelings about the sizing plan they use, have absolutely no idea on how to test the validity of a certain sizing plan. Now let's have a look at an example sizing plan. So you can see here button 2 big blinds, small blind 2.5, cutoff 2.5, MP 3 big blinds, under the gun 3 big blinds. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the sizing plan. It's a pretty reasonable sizing plan. However, let's say I'm speaking to someone who actually open raises the button for 3 big blinds, or they do something that's different from my strategy. Maybe they min raise a small blind or something. Would I then go and tell that player that I think their strategy is terrible and that mine is vastly superior? No, I wouldn't, because ultimately it seems as if default preflop sizings probably don't matter that much. There are some bad sizings we can make. Probably most of us would agree, just based on logic, that it probably doesn't make sense to open raise the button for 10 big blinds or to open raise under the gun for 50 big blinds. So there are some things that we can do which are probably clearly wrong. But so long as we're within the certain threshold described, somewhere around the region of 2 to 3 big blinds from every position, or maybe even pot size in some cases from some of the positions, then it probably doesn't matter too much on the specific sizings we choose, because most of our win rates are going to be generated from post-flop play anyway. However, that doesn't mean that no thought whatsoever should be put into our default preflop sizing plan. We should still use logic to try and think about the best sizings for us. So for example, this is a sizing plan that I commonly use, although you'll find that I vary from this sizing plan very, very heavily based on the scenarios. But let's just say this is a common sizing plan I use in many games. Now, have I picked these numbers at random, just given that I think it doesn't really matter that much? Well, no, not at all. These sizings are based on some measure of logic. So for example, why do I min-raise the button? I min-raise the button because I think it makes it easier to deal with 3 bets. It's a difference between me open raising to 3 big blinds and facing an 11 big blind 3 bet compared to open raising to 2 big blinds and facing a 7 big blind 3 bet. I feel much more comfortable in the second scenario, and psychologically as well, I find it easier to defend because the stack to pot ratio is going to be high post flop. I feel more comfortable that way. That doesn't mean it's wrong to open 3 big blinds. Perhaps you have reasons for doing that. Another thing is, why is my small blind 2.5? Again, this is based on logic. I think about the reverse scenario where I'm in the big blind and I face a min raise from the small blind. I basically never fold in that spot. We have position, we get an amazing price pre-flop. Small blinds open wide ranges these days. I don't want to be in the opposite situation where I'm min raising the small blind and forcing my opponent to defend a hugely wide range against me when he has the advantage of position. I'd rather open a little bit larger from the small blind, but discourage my opponent from calling by doing so. I don't want to open a much larger sizing either. I don't want to open to 3 big blinds or 4 big blinds because now I feel that I'm not getting the best risk to reward ratio on my open. So even though this is not something that's necessarily been demonstrated with empirical analysis, it's not been demonstrated with game theory analysis as such, but there are logical reasons for this sizing plan. So if you're doing something completely different, that's fine. Just make sure your open raise sizings are within acceptable thresholds and that there is some kind of logic supporting your decisions. However, just because default preflop sizings are not that important, this is not to say that preflop sizings are not important. In fact, preflop sizings are hugely important, and because many players have a default sizing strategy, this area of strategy often gets overlooked. So if you're someone that likes to min-raise the button, for example, when was the last time you actually 2.5x or 3x the button, or even 4x the button? If you find that you're always 2xing the button just because that's your standard sizing, you're probably missing out on a decent chunk of your win rate. So let's think about some of the considerations for changing or deviating from our default preflop sizing plan for exploitative reasons. So the first point here is favored SPR. SPR stands for stack to pot ratio. You can read about it in the 2+2 published book, Professional No Limit Hold'em. Essentially describes how many chips we have left for post-flop play. Certain types of hands like a high stack to pot ratio, other types of hands like a low stack to pot ratio. In an ideal world, one in which pre-flop balance considerations were not important and we could just get away with opening any sizing, and in most cases balance considerations are not important, especially lower limit games, so we can get away with using different open sizings for different hands. In an ideal world, we would open some hands for a larger sizing and some hands for a smaller sizing. We would open speculative hands, things like small pocket pairs, suited connectors, for a small sizing in order to generate a high stack to pot ratio. We'd open hands which have reverse implied odds, but have a lot of direct value. Things like ace-jack offsuit, ace-king offsuit, pocket kings, pocket aces. We'd open hands like this for a large sizing in order to generate a low stack to pot ratio. So it's worth thinking about. If we can get away with opening smaller with suited connectors and larger with stuff like ace-queen offsuit, we should probably go and do it. It's going to have a good effect on our win rate over the long run. And balance considerations are not that important. It's very, very common you'll hear players saying, well, I always 2.5x the button, because if I 3x with stronger hands, isn't it obvious? Well, it might be obvious, but no one's paying attention. No one cares that much about your open raising strategy. Especially not if you're in one of the lower limit player pools, where there's just so many players there. I mean, think about it. When was the last time that you personally picked up a sizing tell on your opponent's raise first in sizing strategy? Probably didn't. I mean, sometimes it is really obvious what someone's doing, but in most cases, players won't even notice if there's a 0.5 difference in our open raise sizing. We might open to 3 big blinds on the button. They won't even remember that last orbit we opened to 2.5 big blinds. So we can get away with doing all kinds of stuff pre-flop, which we probably shouldn't be able to get away with in theory. Another factor, post-flop expectation. Now this can mean a number of things, but we're essentially talking about how likely it is that our opponent folds post-flop. So does he have a high fold to c-bet, etc. And generally speaking, if opponent is a little bit of a calling station, doesn't fold too much, and we don't have a value hand, then we probably want to reduce our pre-flop sizing. So let's say we have a suited connector, our opponent's a calling station, we probably want to be min-raising. We've touched on this topic already. Might even want to be min-raising from cutoff, even from MP or UTG in some scenarios. However, the same scenario, our opponent's a calling station, but now we have pocket aces, well, min-raising the button is terrible in that scenario. In fact, if the player in the big blind never folds pre-flop ever, we should experiment with how big we can go. Can we open raise to 5 big blinds? What about 10 big blinds? Think outside the box, don't be afraid to use unorthodox sizings. In a scenario where our opponent does fold way too much to c-bets, sometimes we can describe the situation as a situation with a high postal expectation. Let's say the guy is just calling a bunch of hands pre-flop and then playing fit or fold on the flop. It can be a good idea to increase our pre-flop raise sizing in such scenarios. Why min-raise and win that pot postal every time when we could be 4xing it and win that pot postal every time with a c-bet instead? We'll make more money in the long run this way. Pre-flop inelasticity. So we've kind of touched on this, but not completely. For example, we're in the small blind. We want to work out whether we should steal, and let's say big blind is following a starting hands chart, but he doesn't realize he should be changing his strategy based on the sizing we use. In that scenario, we're going to be raising very small with all of our steal attempts, because he folds the same frequency, but we risk less to take down the pot, so we're going to be coming in for a min raise. If we have something like pocket aces and our opponent is inelastic, then we'll go for a larger sizing because now we extract more value. So we've touched on the second part of that before, but the first part is important as well. Generating the best price on our steal. Now in some cases it's not always that we should just reduce our sizing to increase the profitability of our steal, because generally speaking, the smaller we open, the more an astute opponent is going to defend. So we don't necessarily get a better price by open raising smaller because maybe our opponent just defends that much more often. But in the case where our opponent is not sensitive to our pre-flop raise sizing, we can do a lot with that to increase our profit over the long run. Effective stacks. Players are generally very not careful about the situation. So for example, they'll be on the button, they've got a stealing hand, one of the weaker hands in a button opening range. Let's pick one. So they're on the button, they've got something like King 7 offsuit or 7-4 suited. They're planning on folding to a 3-bet. They come in for a 3 big blind open on the button when there's a 20 big blind short stack in the big blind. The size of this mistake is potentially huge. It might seem like, well, it's only one big blind. That one big blind is really going to add up. It's a big mistake to steal too large when there is a short stack in the blinds, especially if he is volatile or potentially aggressive. It adds up in the long run. Generally speaking, as a rough guide, if there is a short stack behind you, you should probably be reducing your sizing. And it is okay to min-raise from every position. It's fine to min-raise from UTG. Sometimes players forget that. Most sizing plans seem to favor opening larger in the earlier positions and smaller in late positions. There are tables where we should possibly even think about doing the opposite, where we should maybe even open smaller in early. It depends on who is at the table. And certainly if there are volatile short stacks behind us, then we should be reducing our sizing even in the under the gun positions. 3-bet aggression is another thing which is sometimes overlooked. Apart from the fact that against very aggressive opponents we should probably be reducing our stealing frequency, it also makes sense to lay a little bit less on the line with our open raise. So why open raise to 3 big blinds and fold to a 3-bet when we could open raise to 2 big blinds and then fold to a 3-bet? It's less profitable for our opponent, it's less damaging to us. We want to think about these things when we think about open raising pre-flop. Okay, so let's summarize everything. Step number 1, learn default ranges, understand how they're constructed, think about tweaking your own ranges or even constructing your own ranges from scratch. Number 2, attacking type blinds. Steal any 2 from the small blind if big blind's folding over 60%. Steal any 2 from the button if the combined total of small blind and big blind's fold to steal stat is 150 plus. This is very important. Very simple, but very important, and it's surprising how many spots like this players miss. Isolating versus recreational opponents. We should open raise wider if there's a calling station in the blinds. We don't open raise tighter because someone doesn't fold. We open raise looser because they don't fold. The types of loose opponents where we don't open raise wider are the good aggressive regs, not the huge donks. We want to play lots of hands against weaker recreational opponents, and this is a legitimate reason for expanding our open raise frequency. Also, we should even expand our frequency from UTG and MP. We just need to be a little bit more cautious about this. The effect won't be as profound on our overall raising frequency. Finally, we need to understand default and exploitative sizings. Default sizings, not that important so long as we aren't doing anything that's really stupid or doesn't make sense. Exploitative sizings are very important, however, and it's really surprising how many players don't make use of this. They have their default sizing plan and they follow it, and you see them doing all kinds of terrible stuff like min-raising aces on the button when there's a calling station in the big blind, stealing with a suited connector for 3 big blinds when there's a short stacker. These mistakes are fundamental and very costly to our overall win rate. So hopefully this gave you something to think about on a topic which many consider to be basic. Maybe you've decided that the topic is not so basic after all. So as usual, if you have any questions or comments, then you can leave them below the video. You can maybe find me on the forums as well. I have a strategy corner thread now where you can post any questions or comments there also. And also you'll see that there are some regular strategy posts on that thread also. So, yep, thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.